Okay, the next major topic we're going to introduce is animation. Now, animation is particularly important for logo design and for really a lot of the beautiful stuff that you can do in this program. And so this is going to be our focus for today. Now, animation basics, and I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly, and then we're going to do kind of a brief demonstration of what you can do with this. Now, first of all, to understand animation, you have to understand the concept of a timeline. Now, when you're talking, well, I'm just doing this without the board, but that's okay. So I'm going to go on and get the board here. So animation and basics, timeline. A timeline. Basically, we're talking about axes. We're talking about the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. Now, the timeline is the fourth axis. Basically, that is from 0 to 60, let's say. And so, when you have a timeline, that means you have duration. You have an object that's sitting in this position at this part of the time, and then it moves over here at that point. And so that's what animation is all about. Now, timelines are calibrated in what is called frames. Now, you could say, well, why don't we just calibrate them in seconds? Well, in fact, we typically do, but a frame is a particular fraction of a second, and not all timelines have the same frame rate. And so, typically, you have 30 frames per second. And so, 30 frames generally equals a second. And so, if you're counting frames, that's how you would generally do it. So timeline starts here at 0 frames, goes to 60 frames, which would be 2 seconds, and so forth. Now, frames per second, some timelines, like for example, high definition, can have as many as 60 frames per second if you want to do it that way. Typically, old films have 24 frames a second or 50 frames a second, depending on how you look at it. Some multimedia animation can have 18 frames a second or less, depending on what you're trying to do. And some animations, which are animated buttons, for example, only have 2 frames. That's it. The button's up or it's down, and that's an animation too. And so you can have button states, which are the up state, down state, the over state, things like that. And so a timeline can have any number of different frame rates. And to understand how that works, you also have to understand what a keyframe is. Now, a keyframe, I'm going to introduce this concept now, is a frame which designates the beginning or end of movement. And so every frame or every timeline has one keyframe in it. Even if it's just keyframe 1, the object is sitting there and it sits there forever, and so that's it. That's just one keyframe. But let's say you want the keyframe, this is the keyframe, the object is sitting here. Then you want the object over here for the second keyframe. So then you make a keyframe where it's there. In between here is what we call tweening, or tween frames, because the computer will figure out how to get the object from here to here. You don't have to do that. So cell animation is when you literally create a frame for each fraction of a second of motion. And so if you've seen the Nick Park animations, which I enjoyed when I was in graduate school, Wallace and Gromit, the clay figures that move. That's basically cell animation, where they literally animate the scene a very small fraction of a second at a time. And so they may take 30 photographs, each where the little character's moved its arm just a little bit, and then when they play it back, it looks like motion. And so that's cell animation. They used to do that and Walt Disney did that as well. Now, Mickey Mouse was cell animation, except this is where the term came from. Walt Disney himself would draw Mickey Mouse here, let's say, and then he'd draw Mickey Mouse there, and somebody called a tweener would basically draw all the intermediate steps to get from this to this. And so that person was literally called a tweener. Really weird term, but that's still used today because now the computer does it for you. And so it's also important to remember that everything can move, everything. Not just the object, but other elements as well. So if you're animating objects, for example, let's start with objects. Every object has a timeline, as I said, and every object has at least one keyframe because that's where the object starts, and it could be that's where the object ends. Every keyframe designates a position at one point in time. That's we've described what a keyframe is. Another keyframe designates a position at another time. And tweening is all the non-keyframes that are created to get the object from one side of the screen to the other, or whatever it is it's going to do. Could include rotation, things like that. And any object attribute can be keyframed and changed. Now that's, for example, position. You can move the object around. Rotation, the object can spin or turn. The object can get bigger or smaller. The object can stretch. And it can do all these on every axis. And so just there, you've got a lot of latitude. You can move the object and do all kinds of crazy things to the object and animate all of that. Now, animating lights is a different one. The lights create shadows and highlights. And so if you've got a shadow, let's say you've got your object here, you've got a shadow on the back wall, or let's say this is the shadow. Some light source has to be over there creating the shadow. If you move the light source, the shadow moves as well. So for example, if you've ever seen a sundial, you're looking at the sundial, you can see where the position of the sun is, and you can see that position moves because the sun is moving. And so if you play that back in high speed, you can see the shadow moving around. You could actually do that by animating the light. Moving lights create movements of shadow and highlights. These movements can be straight lines or arcs. You know, you can move the shadow, the lights forward or backward, left and right, up and down, or any combination thereof. And so lights have enormous abilities to do crazy things. Now, animating cameras is important as well. Remember, the camera is the point of view of the audience. So you're the audience, you're seeing what the camera sees. Moving the camera moves the audience. So if you're driving through your scene, that's what the audience is seeing. The audience sees the movement of the camera as if they were in a car driving down a road. And this can create some interesting rides. You can put together roller coasters. You can put together, skydiving scenes, things like that. Animating surfaces. Now, this is one that's going to take a little bit more thought because it's different than the others. It's different than timelines because we're not using the same timelines. Here, the surface textures are normally based on still images. Like, for example, when we made the room scenes, like a restaurant scene, you can put a picture of a restaurant background in the back. You could also put a movie of a restaurant in the background, have things moving around. And basically what you're doing is you're animating a sequence of still images. And so you're taking a sequence of still images and you're mapping it into an object. And as long as that sequence moves, or it contains more frames, it will animate. And you can do that with surfaces as well. Surfaces can be movies. Television sets can display actual content. And that will go along with whatever everything else is doing. And textures can appear to morph. And so I'm telling you, this is really an incredible extension of what you're doing here. Now, you might say, well, where's the timeline there? Well, the timeline in that particular case would not be in Lightwave. It would be in Premiere. Because Premiere is generally the movie you're going to use to make image sequences. Because basically you take a piece of video, whatever that is, and then you re-render it as a series of still frames, which then get used in your surface editors. Where you, instead of just having a single image, you have a still frame, or you have a sequence of images. Reflection maps can hint at other movement. You can have images of reflections on surfaces that are moving and doing other crazy things. And if you're applying this to an animated logo, for example, you can have letters move and reassemble. You can have letters change size. You can have the logo itself can move around as a group, and you can have moving parts that can move. And basically, you're designing choreography. And really, if you're going to do this right, you got to practice it. You got to look at it and see, do you like this? No, we'll change it a little bit. Try it again. And so eventually you can get it right. See, that's the difference between this and doing something live on stage. If you do it wrong live on stage, you've done it wrong. If you do it wrong here, you can adjust it just a little bit so that it's perfect. And you can take as long as you want to get it right. And reflections and lights can also move. So you can have sparkling logos and all kinds of crazy effects. And really, it's just the beginning of a bigger world. And of course, parenting and pivot points. We mentioned those earlier. If you're going to have like something with an elbow, you can create the pivot point there and you can have it move that way. All kinds of incredible stuff. And so really that is what we're trying to get you to do, is simple animations, and we'll demonstrate that briefly here. Okay, so for this demonstration, I'm just going to introduce the basics of a timeline. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a simple logo and basically have it assemble itself. Something simple, but to demonstrate the basics of how you would go about doing it. So here we have our modeler program, and all I'm going to do here is to create a simple 3-letter logo. And so I created a company for one of my stories called Baxter Research Group, so let's go with that. So let's start with the logo. So I'm in create mode. I go into the logo tool because we've already seen that to some degree. I'm just going to type BRG, and that will be the initials there. And I'm going to choose a font for that. And I think for this particular case, I'm going to go with something traditional. Let's see. Well, how about this one? Impact. Let's see what Impact looks like. So remember, that's the logo maker. And there it is. And that's pretty good. If you look at the logo here, and I'll zoom in on this over here, you can see, and I'll just move my face here so you can get a better look at it. So we got BRG here. And that's about right. Maybe not all that high-techy like it was originally designed to look. But let's look at that. And then I'm going to give this 2 surfaces. So remember how you do that. I go into polygon mode, and I'm just going to grab the front edge. And so you can see that the letters themselves are lit up in front and only in front. I'm going to, actually before I do that, I'm going to do one other thing first. I'm going to deselect that and just select everything. And so I'm going to go to change surface, and I'm going to call this, we'll just call this whole underscore letter. And then I will deselect this and just select the front and change surface. I'm just going to call that face. So we're really going to have 2 images there. And so then I'm going to do something else. I'm going to put each of these letters on its own layer. So I'm going to start with the first one. So I'm going to leave the first one alone. Then I'm just going to basically take the other letters. I'm just going to go to Edit Cut. Then I'm going to go to the next layer, put the first layer in the background, and Edit Paste, which puts the next 2 letters here. And so then I will select only the last letter, Edit Cut, go to the next one, and Edit Paste. And so then I've got all 3 letters on different layers. So if I go to my, if I go to my 4th layer here, and I just go ahead and choose all these different layers. Let's do that. Keep doing that. So 4th layer, and I just want to get those all in the background. So I'm just going to create a box to put all this on. I'm going to make it a rather substantial box, probably bigger than I really need it to be. But I want to make sure I've got enough room to work with. And of course, I will move that so that the lettering is just slightly above it, about a little room in the back. And so it's going to be a platform. And so that one, I will select all the surfaces there, and I'm going to call that base. And I may not have to do much with that, but I always can. So then I'm just going to save this object, and I'm going to save this. I'm going to call this logo. Then if I'm here in layout, I'm just going to load the object. logo. And there we are. So right now, nothing all that impressive. So since I happen to be in camera mode here, I'm going to go to my camera. I'm going to move the camera forward, and I'm going to move it up a little bit, and I'm going to angle it down. So modify, let's say rotate. And so this may be enough to get us started. So as you can see, there isn't really much going on with this yet. So let's go ahead and go to Surface Editor. And so I will start with my base. And all I'm going to do with the base right now is give it a color. I'm going to give it kind of a neutral color. Let's start with something like that. Maybe that'll be good enough. And so with the B, I'm going to go with the face. The face, let's say that all of these letters are going to be kind of a greenish color. And I could go through and make them all different colors, but let's say for the moment we're going to stick with that. And the whole letter, keeping it relatively simple, we'll give that one kind of a red for some reason. So we can start with that. I don't know if we're going to stick with it, but let's say that's what we got. So if I look at this in VPR, I have that. Now it could be that it has nothing to do with what we want. Let's go back to Surface Editor for a minute here and go to base. And I'm just going to give base some specularity and some glossiness. And I'm going to let it reflect. And so it's going to reflect some of those letters. And the face, I'm going to make that mostly luminescent. And the whole letter, I'm going to put some transparency in there. I'm also going to make that double-sided so you can see more of it. And maybe I'll make that a little bit reflective. So I'm not going for a whole lot here. So in the face, that's mostly luminous, but let's give it some specularity as well. I'm going to stop there because I can easily get carried away, but it's more important that we talk about the animation part. So there is BRG. So I'm going to go back here and look at it in perspective, and I can see that that's where it falls. What I want to do is I want that table to be longer. So I'm going to go back to Modeler, which is here, and I'm going to extend the table back. And so I'm going to grab my, I can do it a couple of different ways. I'm just going to grab those points, and I'm going to go to Modify Move. I'm just going to take that further back. So that will make the table longer. So if I go here, let's see what that did to camera view. Better. And so maybe even a little bit longer still. So if I go here, I can come out a little bit more. Oh, modify, move. So if I scoot that back even more, let's see what that gives me. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I said that's long enough. All I want to do is have those letters kind of assemble. And so we'll do it that way. Now here we go into timelines. So this is the camera view, and this is what the camera's going to see. And we want this in the reflection. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get out of VPR for a second. Right now, layer 1, which is the B, is selected. Now notice down here we got 0 on the timeline. That's where the letter starts. What I want to do is I want to go to my 30 frame mark, which is 1 second. And I want that to be where the keyframe is. That's where I want it to end. So I'm going to hit Create Key. So I'm going to create a key at the 30-second mark. Now notice, it puts a little line there. That's where the keyframe is. Now if you'll note like the playhead, when I drag that there, there's a little bitty tiny triangle that clicks when you put it over there. You see a little triangle? So now I'm going to go back to the first frame. And then for this, I'm going to go into perspective so it's easy to see. And I'm going to lift that upwards. And so in the first frame, B is way high up. As I drag the keyframe, the playhead, you'll see what happens. Okay, so I want that to be over here a little bit. I also want it to be coming in from the front. You see what that did? That shifted the position of the whole thing, so it does that. And then if I'm looking at in the camera view, this is what ends up happening. It comes down like that. So I'm going to do it something even more. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to put some rotation on there. And I'm going to rotate the thing on 2 or 3 axes. Just rotate the hell out of it. So then if I go back to camera view, let's see what that does. And it just tumbles in, which is kind of cute. I kind of like that. Okay, so I'm going to do one other thing. I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to throw myself a curveball here. So if I go back to perspective and I go to move, I'm actually going to move it below the line of the table. And so I've created a secondary position, so it kind of bounces and comes back. Let's see what that does. So if I go back to camera view, so it starts out of the frame. Now here you can even see a little piece of it. Oh, it even dips down below and it comes back up. Boom, and up. So maybe that's not a good move. Maybe it is. I don't know. But we'll go with it. Okay, so that's the B. I'm going to go to the R. And so if I'm in perspective view, the R, I'm going to pull back and shoot up. Actually, before I do that, I got to create that second keyframe, so I'm going to remove that. And I'm going to put that a little bit later, let's say 35 frames, and I'm going to create a keyframe there with the letter in its final position. So then here, I go back, and I come up, and I'm going to put some rotation on that, and I'm just going to rotate it around a couple of times. And so if I then go to my camera view, and I can see, boom, up. And maybe one other thing. Let's say I go back here. Maybe I want to also rotate it that way. And a little bit. Okay, so that's fine. And so maybe I want to have it bounce some or do something weird. So I'll give it a little sneak movement here. So maybe I'll go down a bit and kind of come up. Okay, maybe a little bit something there. So then the G, of course, will go, and that one's going to take a little longer. I'll take it up to 40, create a keyframe there. And then for this one, perspective, I'm going to do that one a little bit differently. I'm just going to have it roll in. I'm going to roll like that. And so, perspective, camera view, and let's see what that does. And okay, not bad necessarily. And so that becomes the animation. And it could be that we want to add, well, let's see what that would look like in VPR. So there's my VPR. So VPR, boom, boom, boom. Actually, that's not too bad. Let's do one other thing though. Let's put some lights in here. So in order to do this, go to my texture shading and perspective. So I'm going to establish what the lighting is going to look like here. And so I'm going to put in some lights. So I'm going to go to my items, and I'm going to create a point light. It's a point light. I'm going to call this P1 for point light. And if I hit OK there, then I get this. Now, notice how the light illuminates things. So I want this light there. Now let's see what that would look like if I'm looking at the camera view and I were looking at my VPR. It's nice and bright. So maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what I'm interested in. But what I want to do is I want to animate that some. So I'm going to go back into perspective view. I'm only going to do one light. I could do several, but I'm only going to do one. So that is the position I want it when the logo assembles. Now, back here, I want that light to be way up high. So let's see. Okay, so you can see the light is moving. You could even make the light come forward like that, so that when everything comes together, it kind of does that. Then I want the light to proceed across the letters like that. Then start doing an arc. And then maybe, see, each of these keyframes, I'm establishing kind of a point there. And then I'm going to try to bring it right about where I want it to finish up. So it'll do like that. Let's see what that would look like in camera view. So right now we see the empty piece, boom, 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 boom. And then it does kind of like a weird halo effect, which may or may not be of all that use to us. And so you can see how the shadows are moving. You can see how everything kind of comes together like that, and it's doing the shadows and stuff. Okay, so there is our completed idea. And so what I want to do is show you how you would take this to the next level. How you would actually export this as a finished product. So to do that, we are going to set up a recording. So that means I'm going to go into the Render tab, and we're going to just go through a couple of things that have to happen in order for this to work. And so they didn't give this a very good name. They call it Render Globals. Render Globals is what you have to do this. And so if we look at this, we're going to just go through the tabs, the parts that you have to know. You'll notice on the general, it starts with frame 1 and goes to frame 120. You'll notice down here that there are 120 frames. And so if there are more frames, then that's where that would end. It's going to step through them one frame at a time. Don't worry about any of that. Basically the render, this will tell you whether or not you're rendering shadows, for example, or things like that. I would leave that at default as well. Really the only thing, there's only one camera here, so there's nothing to change there. The lights, it's going to basically stick with the shadow of the current version there. Output is where it gets a little bit more interesting. For this particular assignment, we're just going to save animation. So I'm going to save this as a simple animation. And so that means I'm going to save it as a video file, which I'm just going to call BRG. So if we're going to do that, look at the type. The type says AVI. Now, I'm going to warn you ahead of time, this is not the way you're going to want to do it most of the time. This is a quick and dirty, very quick and dirty way of seeing what you've got. AVI using this thing's render engine is probably the worst you're going to get. And if you look at compression codecs, we're going to go with probably the oldest codec ever made, Microsoft Video 1. It will work, it just isn't going to be all that snazzy, let's say. It's going to have some errors in it. But then we're going to close this, and all we got to do is hit the F10 button. Now remember, we hit F9 to render a still frame. We're going to hit F10 to render a movie. And it's going to say turn off render display. Let me just pull that here so you can see it. And I don't know why it says that. It doesn't really matter. But I'm going to say no. And then I'm going to get this. You see what it's doing? It's literally rendering every frame in the animation. And it's going through them relatively quickly because this computer is pretty good and there's really not a whole lot of calculations to do. So if you can look at this as it's going by, you can see that it's taking about a second per frame to get through it. So you can see it's actually half a second. And then if you look over here, it's going through the whole sequence. And now it's getting to the point where everything is together. And it's calculating the shadows, the reflections. And so now we can see the movement of the shadows and such. And there we go. And I'm also going to warn you that when you do real work, right now this is rendering at very low resolution. When you do the important work that you're going to be doing for your major projects, this could take hours. Right now I'm working on some animations that are taking somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 minutes per frame, sometimes even longer than that. And so that takes some real patience because you simply can't look at it right away. It's kind of like the old days of film where you would send your film out to be developed and then you would hope that it came back at all. And when it did come back, you know, you'd be overjoyed. You'd look at it and say, you know what, that's all wrong. I got to do it again. And so you do it again and then you send it out and then you don't know for another few days or weeks whether or not it was any good the next time. And so it can take a while. Okay, so now that's all rendered. And you see we have our BRG logo. If I double click on this, it will play it, I think. And it says it doesn't support the codec, which I don't know why it wouldn't. So in this case, I find out that Microsoft has let me down because they would not play back their own codec. So I'm going to go here instead, and I'm going to open with VLC, which is a media player. And look, and let's see. And so you can see that it's doing all its thing. And there you go. Now you notice there's some artifacts there. Those bands there aren't supposed to be there because it doesn't have the ability to dither the reflections. And so we'll talk about how you can make these better as you go along. But this is what I want you to do first. Make a very short animation, no more than 120 frames, and send that to me. And the last thing I'll show you here is another animation I did, which included a lot of very complex models. You see, this is where the camera itself was moving. So the camera itself moves. In this case, the model doesn't really move all that much. Here I'm actually changing, doing individual frames to make the lights come on the robot. Now here is where it gets interesting. Those are movies reflected into the reflection maps. And there the actual hand moves and he looks around. So that was the only real animation the robot did. And then of course, the rest of it is done basically as dissolved from one image to another. And then I've got the movie trailer or the book trailer for a book. So that's basically it. And hopefully we can get through this and get some interesting animations.